In the grand halls of the Zephyrian Empire, where species from 1,000 worlds bow in submission, Princess Verityh has made a sport of humiliating lesser beings. Her razor-sharp tongue and cruel intellect have broken the proudest warriors, the wisest scholars, and the most defiant rebels. No creature has ever withstood her psychological warfare. Then, she meets Marcus Chen, a 17-year-old human from a backwater planet called Earth. While others beg, plead, or rage under her torments, Marcus does something unprecedented: he stays silent. Not the silence of fear or submission, but something far more unsettling. A silence that seems to see right through her, past her royal facade, into the empty void where her soul should be. What Princess Verityh doesn't understand is that humans have spent millennia perfecting the art of endurance. They've survived ice ages, plagues, wars, and horrors that would shatter alien minds. And, sometimes, the most powerful response to cruelty isn't violence or words, it's the unbreakable quiet of someone who has already seen the worst the universe has to offer and chosen to remain human anyway. This is the story of how a teenage boy's silence became the weapon that would humble an empire and redefine what it means to be strong in a universe full of predators. Because sometimes, the greatest victory is simply refusing to let them see you break. The transport ship Meridian shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, its hull groaning under the stress of dimensional transition. Marcus Chen pressed his face against the small porthole, watching as the massive space station grew larger in the darkness. The Zephyrian Imperial Academy hung in the void like a crystal cathedral, its spiraling towers and gleaming surfaces catching the light of 3 different suns. "First time seeing Nexus Prime?" asked Keth, the blue-skinned Altarian sitting across from him. The alien's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a nervous habit Marcus had noticed during their 2-week journey. "Most species find it overwhelming." Marcus nodded but said nothing. He'd learned early in life that silence was often more valuable than words. Growing up in the Detroit ruins after the resource wars had taught him that talking too much could get you killed, and listening could keep you alive. The other passengers in the transport's cramped quarters were a mix of species from across the galaxy. There was Vex, a towering Chronari whose crystalline exoskeleton chimed softly when he moved. Near the back sat Zira, a small reptilian creature from the outer rim whose scales shifted color with her emotions, currently a nervous yellow-green. All of them were scholarship winners, the best and brightest from their respective worlds, chosen to attend the most prestigious educational institution in the known galaxy. All of them except Marcus were talking excitedly about the opportunities ahead. "The Academy has students from over 300 different species," Zira was saying, her scales flickering to an excited orange. "Can you imagine the knowledge we'll gain? The connections we'll make?" "I heard Princess Verityh herself sometimes visits the Academy," added another student, a gaseous being that spoke through a mechanical translator. "She's supposed to be incredibly intelligent. They say she can speak 50 languages fluently and has mastered combat techniques from a dozen different worlds." Marcus had heard the stories too. Princess Verityh of the Zephyrian Empire, daughter of Emperor Karzak the Eternal, was legendary throughout the galaxy. Beautiful, brilliant, and utterly ruthless, she was being groomed to eventually rule an empire that spanned half the known universe. The rumors about her were endless: that she had never lost a debate, never been bested in combat, and never shown mercy to those who opposed her. The transport docked with a soft thud that vibrated through the hull. Marcus shouldered his simple backpack, everything he owned in the universe, and followed the other students through the airlock. The Academy's docking bay was enormous, with ceilings that disappeared into shadow and walls lined with flags representing hundreds of different worlds. Hover platforms moved through the air in precise patterns, carrying cargo and passengers to different levels of the station. A tall figure approached their group. It was humanoid but clearly not human, with pale blue skin, silver hair, and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of centuries. When it spoke, its voice carried the authority of absolute confidence. "Welcome to the Nexus Prime Imperial Academy. I am Administrator THYSS. You are here because you represent the finest intellectual potential of your respective species. Do not disappoint us." The administrator's gaze swept over each student, lingering for a moment on Marcus. There was something in those ancient eyes that made Marcus uncomfortable, as if THYSS could see through his carefully maintained exterior. "You will be sorted into residential pods based on compatibility assessments. Academic schedules will be distributed tomorrow. The academy operates on a merit-based system. Excellence is rewarded, mediocrity is punished, and failure is not tolerated. Questions? None of the students spoke. Marcus noticed how even the most confident among them seemed diminished in the administrator's presence. Good. Follow the guidance markers to your assigned quarters. Rest well. Tomorrow, your education in the ways of the Empire begins. Marcus's assigned quarters were small but comfortable by his standards. After growing up in a converted shipping container in the ruins of Detroit, having a private room with an actual bed felt luxurious. He unpacked his few belongings, some clothes, a worn paperback copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, and a photograph of his mother taken before the cancer took her. The room's communication panel chimed, and a holographic display appeared showing his class schedule. Advanced Xenobiology, Imperial History, Combat Dynamics, Diplomatic Protocol, and something called Hierarchical Social Structures. The last class made him frown. It sounded like an academic way of saying how to know your place in the Empire. Over the next few days, Marcus settled into the rhythm of academy life. The classes were challenging but not impossible for someone who had taught himself advanced mathematics by candlelight and learned chemistry from salvaged textbooks. What proved more difficult was navigating the complex social dynamics of the student body. The academy was a microcosm of the Empire itself, with rigid hierarchies based on species, homeworld status, and family connections. At the top were students from the core worlds, Zephyrians, Altarians, and other species that had been part of the Empire for millennia. Below them were representatives from recently conquered worlds, then vassals, then protectorates. At the very bottom were scholarship students from primitive worlds. Students like Marcus. It didn't take long for the established hierarchy to make itself known. During his third day in combat dynamics class, Marcus found himself paired against Corvus, a Zephyrian noble whose family controlled mining operations in the Vega system. Corvus was bigger, stronger, and had been trained in combat since childhood. He also made it clear that he viewed Marcus as something barely above vermin. "Try not to bleed too much on the mat, primitive," Corvus said as they took their positions. His skin had the typical Zephyrian coloration, deep purple with silver markings that indicated noble birth. "I'd hate for you to stain something important." The instructor, a scarred veteran named Captain Morth, activated the training field. Combat to submission or unconsciousness. Standard Academy rules apply. Corvus attacked immediately, moving with the fluid grace of someone trained in multiple martial disciplines. Marcus dodged the first strike, then the second, but the third caught him in the ribs and sent him stumbling. The Zephyrian pressed his advantage, unleashing a combination of strikes that would have overwhelmed most opponents. But Marcus had learned to fight in the ruins of Earth's dead cities, where combat wasn't about style or honor, it was about survival. He absorbed punishment, waiting for his opponent to make a mistake, learning his patterns. When Corvus overextended on a particularly aggressive attack, Marcus struck. It wasn't a pretty victory. Marcus didn't use any advanced techniques or elegant maneuvers. He simply grabbed Corvus's extended arm, used the alien's momentum against him, and drove an elbow into his opponent's solar plexus with enough force to drop him gasping to the mat. The silence in the training room was deafening. Students from across the galaxy stared at the human who had just defeated one of their social betters. Captain Morth nodded approvingly, but Marcus could see the calculation in the instructor's eyes. He had just painted a target on his back. After class, as Marcus was gathering his things, he heard whispers following him through the corridors. "Did you see that? The primitive beat Corvus. How is that possible? Corvus has been training since he was a child. I heard humans are more violent than most species. Maybe that's why." Marcus kept walking, ignoring the stares and comments. He had learned long ago that attention was usually dangerous, but sometimes it was unavoidable. What worried him more was the look he had seen in Administrator Thyss's eyes when news of the fight reached the administration. It was the look of someone who had just become very interested in something they had previously dismissed. That evening, as Marcus was studying in his quarters, his communication panel chimed again. This time, the message was different from the usual class updates or academy announcements. It was an invitation, no, a summons, to attend a social gathering in the Academy's Grand Hall the following evening. The message was signed with an ornate symbol that Marcus didn't recognize, but the elegant script made it clear this was from someone important. He showed the message to Keth the next morning during their xenobiology class. His Altarian friend's four eyes widened in surprise when he saw the symbol. "Marcus, do you know what this is?" Keth's voice was barely a whisper. "Some kind of party invitation?" "This is the personal seal of Princess Verity H. She's coming to the Academy tomorrow, and she's specifically requested your presence." Keth's blue skin had gone pale. This never happens. The princess doesn't associate with students, especially not scholarship students from primitive worlds. Marcus stared at the symbol, feeling a cold weight settle in his stomach. He had hoped to finish his education quietly, learn what he could, and return to Earth with knowledge that might help his people rebuild. Instead, he had somehow attracted the attention of the most dangerous person in the Empire. "What do you think she wants?" he asked. Keth's scales rippled with nervousness. "I don't know, but when Princess Verity H takes an interest in someone, it's rarely good for them. There are stories, students who caught her attention and were never seen again. Others who were broken so completely that they could barely speak when they returned to their homeworlds." That night, Marcus lay awake staring at the ceiling of his quarters. Through the small window, he could see the lights of ships moving through the darkness, carrying goods and people to every corner of the Empire. Somewhere out there was Earth, his dying homeworld with its struggling population and ruined cities. The knowledge he could gain here might be the key to helping his people rebuild, but only if he survived long enough to return home. He thought about his mother, who had died when he was 14, leaving him alone in the ruins of Detroit. Her last words to him had been simple: "Stay strong, Marcus. No matter what happens, stay human." At the time, he hadn't understood what she meant. Now, facing the prospect of meeting the Empire's most feared princess, he was beginning to understand. The next evening arrived faster than Marcus would have liked. He dressed in his best clothes, which weren't much by Academy standards, and made his way to the Grand Hall. The massive chamber was filled with the Academy's elite students, representatives from various noble families, and what appeared to be several high-ranking military officers. Floating platforms provided additional seating areas, while holographic displays showed views of the Academy's exterior and the stars beyond. Marcus felt out of place among the elegant aliens in their fine clothing and ceremonial dress. He found a spot near the back of the room and tried to blend into the crowd, but he could feel eyes on him from every direction. Word of his fight with Corvus had spread, and everyone seemed curious about the human who had defeated a Zephyrian noble. A hush fell over the room as a section of the far wall slid open. Through it stepped a figure that commanded immediate attention from every being in the room. Princess Verity H was everything the stories claimed and more. She was tall even by Zephyrian standards, with the characteristic purple skin and silver markings, but her markings were more elaborate than any Marcus had seen, intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the light. Her eyes were a brilliant gold that seemed to glow with inner fire, and her presence filled the room like a physical force. She was beautiful in the way that a sword was beautiful, perfect, deadly, and designed for a specific purpose. Students and faculty of the Academy, her voice carried easily through the chamber without amplification. "I come before you today not as a princess of the Empire, but as someone who understands the burden of excellence. You have been chosen from millions of candidates across hundreds of worlds. You represent the future of our civilization." Her gaze swept across the room, and Marcus felt those golden eyes briefly meet his own. There was no recognition there, just the calculating assessment of a predator cataloging potential prey. "The Empire is strong because we demand the best from ourselves and others. We do not coddle weakness or excuse failure. Those who rise to greatness do so through their own merit, while those who fail have only themselves to blame." She paused, and the silence in the room was absolute. "I am told there was an interesting combat demonstration earlier this week. A scholarship student from a primitive world defeated one of our noble-born students." "How fascinating." Marcus felt the attention of the entire room focus on him like the heat of a sun. Students turned to stare, and he could feel their curiosity, contempt, and, in some cases, fear. Princess Verity's golden eyes found him again, and, this time she smiled, an expression that was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Perhaps our primitive friend would join me for a conversation? I find myself curious about the combat techniques of, what was your world called? Earth? It wasn't a request. Marcus made his way through the crowd, feeling like a man walking to his execution. The other students parted before him, some with expressions of pity, others with barely concealed glee at seeing someone else become the target of the princess's attention. When he reached the front of the room, Princess Verity looked down at him from her elevated platform. Up close, she was even more imposing, radiating an aura of absolute confidence and barely contained power. What is your name, human? Marcus Chen, Your Highness. Marcus Chen, she repeated, as if tasting the words. Tell me, Marcus Chen from the primitive world of Earth, what did you think of your victory over young Corvus? The question was clearly a trap, but Marcus wasn't sure what the right answer was supposed to be. Modesty might be seen as weakness, while pride could be viewed as insubordination. So he chose the truth. I thought it was necessary, Your Highness. Necessary? Her eyebrows rose in apparent amusement. How wonderfully direct. Most beings would have offered some elaborate justification or false modesty. But, you simply did what was necessary. She began to pace back and forth on her platform, like a predator circling prey. Tell me, what makes a human necessary? Again, Marcus chose honesty. We adapt, Your Highness. We survive. Adapt and survive. Princess Verity stopped pacing and stared down at him with those golden eyes. How primitive. How crude. Do you know what makes Zephyrians superior to species like yours, Marcus Chen? No, Your Highness. We do not merely adapt. We dominate. We do not merely survive. We conquer. We took the chaos of 1,000 different worlds and created order. We brought civilization to species that were still hitting rocks together when we achieved interstellar flight. Her voice was growing harder, more intense. We are builders of empires, Marcus Chen. What are humans? The entire room was watching now, waiting to see how the human would respond to the princess's verbal assault. Marcus could feel the weight of their expectations, their desire to see him break under the pressure of her words and presence. Instead, he said nothing. The silence stretched for long seconds. Princess Verity's expression shifted from confident superiority to something like confusion. She was clearly waiting for him to defend his species, to argue with her assessment, or to break down under the psychological pressure. When none of those things happened, she leaned forward slightly. Did you not hear my question, human? I heard it, Your Highness. Then, answer it. What are humans? Marcus looked up at her, meeting those golden eyes directly. In that moment, he made a decision that would change everything. He chose to remain silent not out of fear or submission, but as an act of quiet defiance. Because sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty was simply refusing to participate in it. I asked you a question, Princess Verity's voice had taken on a dangerous edge. Marcus continued to meet her gaze, saying nothing. The silence in the grand hall was so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. Around them, hundreds of students and faculty watched in fascination and horror as a 17-year-old human from a primitive world refused to respond to a direct command from the heir to the empire. Princess Verity stared down at him for what felt like an eternity. Her golden eyes searched his face, looking for some sign of the fear or defiance she was accustomed to seeing. Instead, she found something she had never encountered before, complete, unshakable calm. Finally, she smiled again, but this time there was something different in her expression. Something that might have been respect, or interest, or perhaps just the recognition that she had found something unexpected. How remarkable, she said softly. The human chooses silence. How perfectly primitive. She gestured dismissively, and Marcus understood that he was being released. As he walked back through the crowd, he could feel every eye in the room following him. Some students looked at him with awe, others with pity, but Princess Verity's golden gaze burned into his back like a physical weight. As he reached the back of the room, Marcus heard her voice carrying over the crowd once more. How fascinating it will be to see how long such primitive resolve can last. The words sent a chill down Marcus's spine, but he kept walking. Behind him, the social gathering continued, but he knew that everything had changed. He had caught the attention of the most dangerous person in the Empire, and she had just made it clear that his education at the academy was about to become very different from what he had originally planned. That night, alone in his quarters, Marcus stared out at the stars and thought about his mother's words, "Stay human, no matter what happens." He was beginning to understand that staying human in a place like this might be the greatest challenge he had ever faced. But he also knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would not break. No matter what Princess Verity H had planned for him, no matter what torments she devised, he would remain who he was. Because sometimes, being human meant standing firm in the face of overwhelming power and refusing to let it change you. The real test was just beginning. The next morning brought changes to Marcus's schedule that confirmed his worst fears. 3 of his regular classes had been replaced with special instruction sessions that provided no details about their content or location. When he arrived at his first class, Advanced Xenobiology, he found Professor Yinth waiting with an expression of barely concealed sympathy. "Mr. Chen," the elderly Caraxian said, his tentacled face writhing with nervous energy. "I've been instructed to inform you that your academic program has been modified. You're to report to Training Complex 7 immediately." Marcus nodded and gathered his things. As he left the classroom, he could hear whispers following him. "Poor human. Verity H has marked him. I give him a week before he breaks. Remember what happened to that Regelian student last year?" He tried to stand up to her too. Training Complex 7 was located in a section of the academy that Marcus had never visited before. The corridors here were different, older, more utilitarian, with walls of dark metal instead of the gleaming crystal used in the public areas. The lighting was dimmer too, casting long shadows that seemed to move as he walked. The complex itself was a large circular chamber with a high ceiling and walls lined with various types of training equipment. Combat circles, obstacle courses, and what appeared to be torture devices from a dozen different worlds were arranged throughout the space. At the center of it all stood Princess Verity H, no longer wearing the elegant gown from the previous evening. Instead, she was dressed in form-fitting combat attire that highlighted her athletic build while still managing to look regal. She was not alone. Standing beside her was a figure that made Marcus's blood run cold: Captain Thex of the Imperial Guard, a being whose reputation for cruelty was legendary throughout the galaxy. The captain was massive even by Zephyrian standards, with ritual scars covering his purple skin and eyes like chips of black ice. "Ah, our primitive student arrives," Princess Verity H said as Marcus approached. "I hope you slept well, Marcus Chen. You'll need your strength for what comes next." Marcus stopped a respectful distance away and waited. He had learned that responding too quickly was often seen as insubordination, while remaining silent could be interpreted as defiance. The key was to find the balance between the two. "Tell me, human, what do you know about the Empire's educational philosophy?" the princess asked, beginning to pace around him in a slow circle. "I know that it emphasizes hierarchy, discipline, and service to the greater good of the Empire, Your Highness." A textbook answer. How disappointing. She completed her circle and stopped directly in front of him. The truth is far more complex. The Empire understands that strength comes not from coddling the weak, but from forcing them to transcend their limitations. We break down the false constructs of individuality and rebuild our subjects as instruments of imperial will. Captain Thex stepped forward, his massive frame casting Marcus in shadow. "The princess has graciously offered to personally oversee your advanced education, human. You should be honored." Marcus said nothing, but he felt the weight of what was happening settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't about education, it was about breaking him, about proving that human resolve was just another primitive weakness that could be overcome with sufficient pressure. "We'll begin with something simple," Princess Verity H said, gesturing to a section of the chamber where several alien devices were arranged on a metal table. "Pain tolerance assessment. Captain Thex will apply graduated stimuli while I observe your responses. The goal is to map your species' neurological breaking points." The next hour was a nightmare that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. The devices used electrical stimulation, sonic pulses, and neurological interferons designed to cause maximum discomfort without permanent damage. Captain Thex applied each torture with professional detachment, carefully monitoring Marcus's vital signs while Princess Verity H took notes on a holographic tablet. Through it all, Marcus remained silent. He bit his tongue until it bled, clenched his fists until his nails drew blood from his palms, and focused on a single point on the far wall. When the pain became unbearable, he retreated deep into his mind, to memories of his mother reading to him by candlelight, to the feeling of morning sun breaking through the clouds over the Detroit ruins, to anything that reminded him of who he was beneath the agony. Fascinating, Princess Verity H murmured as Captain Thex finally shut down the devices. Most species begin vocalizing within the first 10 minutes. The human has maintained complete silence for over an hour. Perhaps we need to try more aggressive methods, Your Highness, the captain suggested, his scarred hand reaching for a device that looked like it had been designed in the depths of hell itself. No. The princess held up a hand. This session is complete. Mr. Chen, you may return to your quarters. We'll continue tomorrow. Marcus forced himself to walk steadily as he left the chamber, but once he was alone in the corridor, his legs gave out and he had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. His entire body felt like it was on fire, and his hands shook uncontrollably. But he was still whole, still himself. The pattern continued for the next week. Each morning, Marcus attended his regular classes, trying to maintain the facade of normal academy life. Each afternoon, he reported to Training Complex 7 for his special instruction. The torture sessions grew longer and more sophisticated as Princess Verity H and Captain Thex explored different approaches to breaking him. They tried sensory deprivation, leaving him in a soundproof chamber for hours with nothing but his own thoughts. They tried psychological warfare, forcing him to watch holographic recordings of human cities being destroyed in the Empire's conquest of Earth. They tried exhaustion, making him perform meaningless tasks for hours without rest. Through it all, Marcus remained silent. His fellow students began to look at him with a mixture of awe and terror. Word of his daily sessions with the princess had spread throughout the academy, and everyone knew what was happening even if they didn't dare speak of it openly. Some avoided him entirely, afraid that associating with Princess Verity H's target might bring unwanted attention. Others, like Keth and Zira, tried to offer support in small ways, sitting with him at meals, sharing notes from classes he had missed, providing silent companionship when words would have been too dangerous. "Why don't you just give her what she wants?" Zira asked one evening as they sat in the academy's common area. Her scales were a worried blue-green, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "Everyone knows you're stronger than she expected. You've proven your point." Marcus looked at his reptilian friend, considering how to answer. The truth was complex, rooted in experiences that these alien students could never understand. He had grown up in a world where showing weakness meant death, where the strong preyed on the weak without mercy, and where survival depended on your ability to endure pain without breaking. "Because if I break now, I'll never stop breaking," he finally said. "She's not trying to teach me anything. She's trying to prove that humans can be broken like everyone else. If I give in, then everything my people have suffered to get me here will have been meaningless." Keth's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of deep thought among his people. But what if she never stops? What if she keeps pushing until... Until what? Marcus asked. Until I die? Then, I die. But I won't become what she wants me to become. The Altarian stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus could see something like understanding dawning in his alien features. "Your species really is different, isn't it?" "We're survivors," Marcus said simply. "We've been prey for most of our history. We learned how to endure things that would break other species because we had no choice. The strong ate the weak, the weather tried to kill us, the planet itself seemed designed to wipe us out. The ones who survived weren't necessarily the strongest or the smartest, they were the ones who refused to give up." That night, as Marcus lay in his bed trying to ignore the persistent ache in his body from that day's session, he received an unexpected visitor. His room's security system chimed, and the door slid open to reveal Administrator THYSS. The ancient alien looked even older than usual, his silver hair dim in the low light. "May I come in, Mr. Chen?" Marcus sat up, nodding. The administrator entered and took a seat in the room's single chair, his movements careful and deliberate. "I've been following your progress with great interest," THYSS said. "Your performance in regular classes remains exemplary despite your additional responsibilities. Most students would have seen their academic work suffer under such circumstances. I'm here to learn, sir. I won't let anything interfere with that. Even torture? Even the focused attention of the Empire's most dangerous princess?" THYSS leaned forward, his ancient eyes studying Marcus intently. "Tell me, what do you hope to accomplish with this resistance? Do you think you can actually defeat her?" Marcus considered the question carefully. He had asked himself the same thing many times over the past week. "I don't think I can defeat her, sir. But I don't think she can defeat me either. So we're at an impasse. And you're content with that? To spend your time here being tortured for no greater purpose than proving a point?" "The point matters," Marcus said quietly. "Not just for me, but for every human who might come after me. If I break, then the Empire learns that humans can be broken. If I don't break, then maybe the next human who finds themselves in this situation will have a better chance." Administrator THYSS sat back, a strange expression crossing his features. "You know, in my 3 centuries of service to the Empire, I have seen countless species incorporated into our civilization. Most adapt quickly, learning to accept their place in the hierarchy and find contentment in service. Others resist for a time before eventually finding their proper role. But humans..." He shook his head. "Humans are different." "How so?" "Most species, when faced with overwhelming force, eventually recognize the futility of resistance. They make the logical choice to submit rather than suffer needlessly. But humans seem to have this peculiar defect: you continue to resist even when resistance is completely irrational." Marcus almost smiled at that. "My mother used to say that being human meant being stubborn about the right things." "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman. What happened to her?" "She died during the famine years after the conquest. Cancer, but really she died because we couldn't get the medical supplies we needed." Marcus felt the familiar ache in his chest that came whenever he thought about his mother's last days. "She could have lived if we'd had access to imperial medical technology, but Earth was classified as a protectorate world. We weren't considered worthy of advanced treatment." THYSS was quiet for a long moment, and, when he spoke again, his voice was softer than Marcus had ever heard it. "I'm sorry for your loss. Loss of a parent is difficult for any species, but I understand that humans form particularly strong emotional bonds with their offspring." "She's why I'm here," Marcus said. "Not for revenge or anything like that. But I want to learn everything I can so that maybe someday Earth won't be dependent on the Empire's mercy for basic necessities." "And you think Princess Verity's torture sessions are helping you achieve that goal?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer. "They're teaching me something about the Empire that I couldn't learn in any classroom. They're showing me what we're really dealing with, what my people are up against. That knowledge might be just as valuable as anything else I learn here." Administrator THYSS stood, moving toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back to Marcus with an expression that might have been respect. "Be careful, Mr. Chen. Princess Verity is not accustomed to failure, and she's beginning to see your resistance as exactly that. There are rumors that she's planning to escalate her methods significantly." After the administrator left, Marcus lay awake staring at the ceiling. He knew that THYSS was right. Princess Verity was growing frustrated with her inability to break him, and frustrated royalty was dangerous royalty. But he also knew that he had passed the point of no return. Even if he wanted to break now, even if he tried to give the princess what she wanted, it would be meaningless. She would see through any pretense, and his suffering would have been for nothing. The next morning brought a change in routine. Instead of reporting to Training Complex 7 after his regular classes, Marcus was escorted by Imperial guards to a section of the academy he had never seen before. The corridors here were different again, not the utilitarian metal of the training complex, but something that looked almost organic, with walls that curved and flowed like the inside of some vast creature. The chamber they brought him to was enormous, with a domed ceiling that displayed a real-time view of the space around the academy. Stars wheeled slowly overhead, and, in the distance, Marcus could see the ships of the Imperial fleet conducting maneuvers. The floor was a single sheet of black stone polished to a mirror finish, and the only furniture was a raised platform at the center where Princess Verity waited. She had changed again, this time wearing what appeared to be ceremonial armor, ornate plates of purple metal inscribed with silver runes that seemed to shift and writhe when Marcus looked at them directly. Her golden eyes were brighter than ever, and there was something different about her expression. Where before there had been casual cruelty and calculating intelligence, now there was something that looked almost like obsession. "Welcome to the Chamber of Truth, Marcus Chen," she said as the guards withdrew, leaving them alone in the vast space. "This is where we will finally get to the heart of what makes you so persistent." Marcus walked to the center of the chamber but said nothing. The pattern was established now: she would talk, he would remain silent, and they would continue their strange dance of wills. "I've been thinking about you quite a lot lately," the princess continued, beginning her familiar pacing. "Trying to understand what drives this peculiar stubbornness of yours. At first, I thought it was simple pride, the natural resistance of an inferior species refusing to acknowledge its betters. But that's not it, is it?" She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see his reflection in her golden eyes. "You're not fighting for your pride. You're not even fighting for your own dignity. You're fighting for something much more abstract, much more human." She tilted her head, studying him like a fascinating specimen. "You're fighting for the idea of resistance itself. The notion that some things shouldn't be surrendered no matter the cost." Marcus met her gaze but said nothing. "How wonderfully primitive," she whispered. "How beautifully irrational. Most civilized species understand that all principles have their price, that any position can be abandoned if the alternative is sufficiently unpleasant. But humans seem to think that some things are worth more than survival itself." She began pacing again, her armor chiming softly with each step. "Do you know what I find most fascinating about your species? It's not your stubbornness or your capacity for violence or even your remarkable adaptability. It's your ability to find meaning in meaningless suffering. To transform pain into purpose." She laughed, a sound like silver bells ringing in an empty cathedral. "It's completely illogical, and, yet, there's something almost admirable about it." For the first time in their encounters, Princess Verity seemed to be speaking to him rather than at him. There was something different in her voice, something that might have been genuine curiosity rather than cruel amusement. "Tell me something, Marcus Chen. If I were to offer you a bargain, complete freedom from these sessions, elevation to full citizenship in the Empire, access to all the resources you would need to help your dying world, what would you ask for in return?" Marcus considered the question carefully. It was clearly another trap, but there was something in her tone that suggested she genuinely wanted to know his answer. "What would you want me to give up?" he asked. "Nothing you haven't already sacrificed. I would simply ask you to kneel. Here, now, in this chamber. Acknowledge the superiority of the Empire and your rightful place within it. Accept the natural order of things." The offer hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Marcus could almost see it, the easy path, the rational choice, the end to his suffering and the beginning of a life where he could actually make a difference for his people. All he had to do was bend his knee to the most powerful empire in the galaxy. Instead, he said nothing. Princess Verity waited, her golden eyes searching his face for any sign that he was considering the offer. When none came, she nodded slowly. "I didn't think so. But I had to ask." She moved to a control panel built into her platform and began activating systems that Marcus couldn't identify. "In that case, we move to the next phase of your education. What you've experienced so far has been preliminary. Now we begin the real work." The chamber began to change around them. The walls themselves seemed to come alive, flowing and reshaping until Marcus found himself standing in what appeared to be a perfect recreation of his childhood home in the Detroit ruins. Every detail was exact: the cracked concrete floors, the rust stains on the metal walls, even the faded photograph of his mother on the makeshift shelf. "Holographic reconstruction based on Imperial surveillance data," Princess Verity explained, her voice now coming from speakers hidden throughout the illusion. We've been monitoring Earth much more closely than your people realize. We know about every settlement, every family, every individual who has managed to survive in your world's ruins. The scene shifted, and Marcus found himself looking at a perfect recreation of the memorial service held for his mother. He could see himself at 14, standing beside the makeshift grave while the handful of other survivors said their goodbyes. The pain of that memory hit him like a physical blow, and, for the first time since the torture sessions began, he felt his composure crack. Interesting, the princess's voice commented. Elevated stress indicators, but still no vocalization. Let's try something more recent. The scene changed again, this time showing him the day he received notification of his acceptance to the academy. He watched his younger self reading the message over and over, hardly daring to believe it was real. He saw himself packing his few possessions, saying goodbye to the friends who had become his family in the ruins, promising to return with knowledge that could help rebuild their world. Such hope, Princess Verity's voice was almost gentle now. Such beautiful, naive hope. Tell me, Marcus-Chen, what do you think will happen to those friends when you don't return home? When they realize that their great hope for the future died in an academy training chamber, broken by a princess's curiosity? The images shifted one final time, showing him scenes that couldn't be real: Imperial ships over Earth, his friends being rounded up and processed for execution, the ruins of Detroit being leveled to make room for an Imperial mining operation. It was all false, all designed to break his spirit, but the emotional impact was devastating nonetheless. Marcus closed his eyes and forced himself to breathe steadily. These weren't real memories, they were fabrications designed to weaponize his emotions against him. Princess Verity was trying to make him complicit in his own breaking by using his love for his people as a torture device. When he opened his eyes again, the chamber had returned to its original state. Princess Verity was standing directly in front of him, close enough to touch, her golden eyes blazing with something that looked almost like respect. Still nothing, she whispered. Not even when faced with the destruction of everything you claim to care about. How remarkable. She reached out and touched his face with one finger, the contact surprisingly gentle. You really are fascinating, Marcus-Chen. I'm beginning to understand why my intelligence reports on human psychology were so contradictory. She stepped back, and Marcus could see that something fundamental had changed in her expression. The casual cruelty was still there, but it was overlaid now with something else, something that might have been recognition of an equal rather than dismissal of an inferior. We'll continue tomorrow, she said finally. But I want you to think about something tonight. You've proven that you can endure pain and resist psychological manipulation. But can you watch others suffer for your stubbornness? Can you maintain your silence when the price of your resistance is paid by those you care about? The threat was clear, and Marcus felt ice settle in his veins. Up until now, the torture had been personal, something he could endure because the only person paying the price was himself. But if Princess Verity was suggesting that she would target other students, other humans, his friends? Think carefully, she said as the guards returned to escort him back to his quarters. Because tomorrow, we find out just how far human nobility extends when it's others who pay the price. As Marcus was led through the academy's corridors, he realized that Princess Verity had finally found a weapon that might actually work against him. Up until now, he had been able to endure anything she threw at him because his suffering was his own choice, his sacrifice to make. But if she started hurting innocent people to get to him, if she made others pay the price for his resistance. That night, alone in his quarters, Marcus stared out at the stars and tried to prepare himself for a test that would challenge not just his endurance, but the very foundations of who he was as a human being. Marcus didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat by his small window watching the ships move through space, their running lights like moving stars against the infinite darkness. He knew that somewhere among those vessels was the Imperial fleet, with its vast cargo holds full of tribute from 1,000 conquered worlds. Earth was just one more entry in their catalogs of subjugated planets, its people just another resource to be managed and controlled. When morning came, he attended his regular classes as usual, but he could feel the weight of impending crisis pressing down on him. Other students avoided his gaze, conversations stopped when he entered rooms, and even the faculty seemed nervous around him. Word had spread that Princess Verity's interest in the human student was escalating, and everyone at the academy understood what that meant.
During the break between diplomatic protocol and imperial history, Keth approached him with obvious reluctance.
The Eltarian's 4 eyes were dim with worry, and his blue skin had taken on an unhealthy gray tint. "Marcus," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard.
"I need to tell you something. Last night, after evening meal, 3 students were called to the administrator's office. Zira, Vex, and myself."
Marcus felt his stomach drop, but he kept his expression neutral.
"What did they want?" They asked us questions about you. About our friendship, about things you said, about whether we'd ever discussed resisting imperial authority." Keth's scales rippled with anxiety.
"We told them nothing important, but, Marcus, they know we're close to you.
They know you have friends here."
"I'm sorry," Marcus said, and he meant it. He had hoped to keep his fellow students out of whatever game Princess Verity was playing, but it seemed that was no longer possible.
"Don't apologize," Keth said quickly. "We knew the risks when we chose to be your friends."
"But, Marcus, whatever she's planning, whatever she's going to ask of you, remember that we made our choice too. Don't let her use our friendship as a weapon against you." Before Marcus could respond, the Eltarian hurried away, leaving him alone with the terrible certainty that Princess Verity was about to escalate their conflict in ways he hadn't imagined. That afternoon, when the guards came to escort him to his session, they didn't take him to the Chamber of Truth or Training Complex 7. Instead, they led him through sections of the academy he had never seen before, deep into what seemed to be the station's administrative core. The corridors here were different from anywhere else, sterile white walls broken by observation windows that looked into various chambers and laboratories. They stopped at a heavy door marked with symbols that Marcus didn't recognize, but their meaning was clear enough from context: authorized personnel only, extreme danger, psychological research division. The guards activated the door's locking mechanism with biometric scanners, and it slid open to reveal Princess Verity waiting in what was clearly an observation room. The chamber beyond the observation window made Marcus's blood freeze. It was a smaller version of the torture chambers he had become familiar with, but this one contained 3 restraining devices that were already occupied. Keth, Zira, and Vex were secured in the alien equivalent of medieval stocks, their heads and limbs locked in position while various monitoring devices tracked their vital signs. "Good afternoon, Marcus Chen," Princess Verity said without turning to look at him. She was studying readouts on a holographic display, making notes with the same clinical detachment she had shown during his own torture sessions.
"I trust you recognize our guests?"
Marcus forced himself to remain calm, but every instinct was screaming at him to throw himself at the reinforced window, to find some way to reach his friends, to do anything except stand there helplessly watching. "They volunteered for this, you know," the princess continued conversationally. "When I explained that their participation would contribute to a better understanding of interspecies friendship dynamics, they were quite eager to help."
Such admirable loyalty to their human friend.
Through the window, Marcus could see that his friends were conscious and aware, but their restraints prevented them from speaking or moving. Their eyes were wide with fear, but when Keth spotted Marcus through the observation window, the Eltarian managed something that might have been an encouraging nod. "The experiment is quite simple," Princess Verity explained, moving to a control console built into the observation room's wall. "I will apply graduated pain stimuli to your friends while you watch. The goal is to determine whether human empathy can overcome human stubbornness when the suffering is distributed to others." Her hand hovered over the control interface, and Marcus could see that it was designed to operate the same torture devices he had experienced firsthand. Electrical stimulation, sonic pulses, neurological interferons, all the tools that had failed to break him would now be used against innocent beings whose only crime was showing him kindness. "You can end this at any time," the princess said softly.
"Simply kneel and acknowledge the Empire's superiority, as I offered yesterday.
Accept your place in the natural order, and your friends will be released unharmed." Marcus stared through the window at his friends. Zira's scales had gone completely pale with fear, but she was looking directly at him with an expression that was unmistakably resolute. Even terrified and helpless, she was trying to communicate that he should stay strong. Vex's crystalline body was resonating with stress harmonics that Marcus could hear even through the reinforced glass, but the Chronari was also shaking his head in a clear gesture of refusal. "Don't give in for our sake."
"They're very brave," Princess Verity observed, following his gaze. But bravery has its limits. Shall we find out what those limits are? She activated the first device, and Keth's body went rigid as electrical current coursed through his restraints. The Altarian's 4 eyes squeezed shut, but he didn't make a sound. The current lasted only a few seconds, but when it ended, Keth was trembling. Fascinating, the princess murmured, checking her readouts. Altarian neural networks are quite sensitive to electrical stimulation. This should be most instructive. She reached for the controls again, and Marcus felt something break inside his chest. This was wrong in ways that went beyond simple cruelty. His friends hadn't chosen this fight, hadn't made the decision to resist the Empire's power. They were being tortured simply because they had shown kindness to a human, and their suffering was being used as a weapon against him. But, even as every instinct screamed at him to give in, to end their pain by surrendering his principles, Marcus found himself thinking about his mother's words, "Stay human, no matter what happens." Being human meant accepting responsibility for your choices and their consequences, but it also meant not allowing evil to make you complicit in its own spread. If he gave in now, if he knelt before Princess Verity H to spare his friends, what message would that send? That humans could be controlled through threats to others? That their resistance was conditional, dependent on the safety of those they cared about? The precedent would be set, and every human who came after him would be vulnerable to the same manipulation. Princess Verity H activated the device again, and this time she targeted Zira. The reptilian's scales flashed through a rapid spectrum of colors as her body's pain responses overwhelmed her emotional control systems. Still, she managed to meet Marcus's eyes through the window and shake her head slightly, as if to say, "Don't you dare give in for my sake." "Your friends are remarkably loyal," the princess commented, increasing the intensity of the stimulation. "But loyalty has its breaking point. Perhaps we should test their limits more thoroughly." For the next hour, Marcus was forced to watch his friends suffer in ways that made his own torture sessions seem mild by comparison. Princess Verity H was a master of her craft, applying just enough pain to cause maximum distress without risking permanent damage. She rotated between the 3 prisoners, ensuring that none of them had time to fully recover before the next wave of agony began. Through it all, Marcus remained silent. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. Every scream that his friends couldn't voice echoed in his own mind. Every tremor of pain that shook their bodies felt like it was tearing pieces from his soul. But he also knew that giving in would accomplish nothing. Princess Verity H would simply have learned that humans could be controlled through threats to others, and the torture would continue under different pretexts. "I must admit, I'm impressed," the princess said as she finally shut down the devices. "I expected your resolve to crumble within the first few minutes. Instead, you've watched your closest friends suffer for an entire hour without showing any sign of breaking." She turned away from the controls to study Marcus directly, her golden eyes searching his face for some clue to his thinking. "Tell me, Marcus-Chen, what thoughts sustain you through something like this? What philosophy allows you to watch innocent beings suffer for your principles?" For the first time since their confrontations began, Marcus felt compelled to answer. Not because her torture had broken his silence, but because he needed to make something clear to both of them. "They're not suffering for my principles," he said quietly. "They're suffering because you chose to torture them. I'm not responsible for your evil." Princess Verity H's eyebrows rose in apparent surprise. How wonderfully human. Even faced with the consequences of your stubbornness, you refuse to accept responsibility for the outcome. "If I knelt to you now, would you release them and never threaten them again?" "Of course not. I would simply have learned that you can be controlled through threats to others. The next time I needed your compliance, I would know exactly what leverage to apply. Then, my choice isn't between their suffering and their safety. It's between teaching you that humans can be controlled through cruelty to others, or teaching you that we cannot." Marcus met her golden gaze directly. "You're going to hurt people regardless of what I do. The only question is whether I help you perfect your techniques." The princess stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus could see something shifting in her expression. It wasn't surrender or defeat, but it might have been a kind of recognition, the acknowledgement that she was facing something she hadn't encountered before. "Release them," she said finally. "Your Highness?" Captain Thex, who had been standing silently in the corner of the observation room,
stepped forward with obvious confusion.
Release the prisoners, Captain.
This particular experiment has yielded all the data we're likely to obtain. As the restraints around his friends were deactivated, Marcus felt some of the tension leave his body. They were alive, they were conscious, and, while they had suffered, they didn't appear to have been permanently harmed. That was more than he had dared hope for when the session began.
This doesn't mean you've won, Princess Verity said as medical personnel entered the torture chamber to attend to the 3 students.
It simply means that I need to reconsider my approach.
I never thought I was winning, Marcus replied. I just thought I was surviving. Surviving.
The princess seemed to taste the word.
Yes, I suppose that is what humans do, isn't it? You survive. You endure. You refuse to break even when breaking would be the rational choice.
She began pacing again, but this time it seemed more thoughtful than predatory.
Do you know what I find most frustrating about you, Marcus Chin? I couldn't guess, Your Highness. You're making me question things that I've never questioned before.
Things that are fundamental to everything I believe about strength, power, and civilization itself.
She stopped in front of the observation window, watching as his friends were helped from their restraints.
For my entire life, I believed that the strong naturally dominate the weak, that civilization advances through the application of superior force, and that resistance to overwhelming power is simply irrationality. She turned back to him with an expression that was almost vulnerable.
But, you resist not because you believe you can win, but because you believe resistance itself has value.
You endure suffering not because you enjoy it, but because you think some things are worth more than personal comfort.
It's completely illogical, and, yet.
She paused, as if struggling to find the right words.
And, yet there's something compelling about it.
Marcus said nothing, but he could see that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. Princess Verity was no longer talking to him as a superior to an inferior, or even as a torturer to her victim. She was speaking to him as one intelligent being to another, trying to understand a perspective that challenged her most basic assumptions. Tomorrow, she said finally, we try something different. I want to understand how your species develops this peculiar relationship with suffering.
Report to the Academy's historical archives at 0800. We're going to study human history together.
As Marcus was escorted back to his quarters, he reflected on what had just happened. Princess Verity had backed down from torturing his friends, not because he had broken or begged, but because she had learned what she needed to know. His silence in the face of others' suffering had taught her something about human nature that no amount of direct torture could have revealed. But he also knew that this was far from over. If anything, Princess Verity's growing fascination with human psychology was more dangerous than her simple cruelty had been. A torturer who wanted to break him was predictable, a torturer who wanted to understand him was something else entirely. That evening, as Marcus was tending to his friends in the Academy's medical bay, Zira managed to speak despite the pain medication clouding her system. You did the right thing, she whispered, her scales flickering weakly between colors. If you had given in to save us, it would have made everything we went through meaningless. I'm sorry, Marcus said, and he meant it more than he had ever meant anything in his life. Don't be, Keth added, his voice hoarse from the stress of the torture session.
We knew the risks when we chose to be your friends. What happened today, it wasn't your fault.
Vex, whose crystalline body was still resonating with stress harmonics, managed to make his translator work long enough to add, proud to stand with human. Proud to resist empire together. As Marcus sat with his injured friends, he realized that something had changed in him as well. Up until now, his resistance had been primarily personal, a refusal to let Princess Verity break his spirit or compromise his principles. But, seeing his friends suffer for their loyalty to him, seeing their courage in the face of torture they didn't deserve, had transformed his solitary act of defiance into something larger.
He was no longer just representing himself or even humanity.
He was representing the idea that friendship could transcend species boundaries, that loyalty could exist without domination, and that some bonds were stronger than the fear of punishment. Princess Verity had tried to use his friends against him, but instead she had taught him that he wasn't fighting alone. The next morning, Marcus reported to the Academy's historical archives as instructed. The archive chamber was vast, with walls lined floor to ceiling with data storage devices containing the recorded history of thousands of civilizations. Holographic displays showed star maps, battle formations, and cultural artifacts from across the galaxy, while automated systems hummed quietly as they processed and cataloged the Empire's accumulated knowledge. Princess Verity was waiting for him at a central console, but she had changed again. Gone was the ceremonial armor or combat attire. Instead, she wore simple robes that were elegant without being ostentatious. Her golden eyes were thoughtful rather than cruel, and, when she looked at him, it was with the attention of a scholar rather than a torturer.
Good morning, Marcus Chen. I trust your friends are recovering well?
They are, Your Highness.
Thank you. Don't thank me.
I'm the one who hurt them in the first place. She gestured to a chair beside the console.
Sit. We have much to discuss. Marcus took the offered seat, uncertain what this new approach might entail.
Princess Verity activated the holographic displays, and, suddenly, they were surrounded by images from human history, cave paintings, ancient cities, medieval battles, industrial revolutions, and space launches. I spent most of the night studying your species' historical records, she said, manipulating the displays to focus on specific periods. What I found was illuminating.
Tell me, what do you see when you look at these images?
Marcus studied the rotating displays, watching as humanity's story unfolded around them. There was beauty in some of the images, art and architecture, moments of triumph and discovery. But there was also terrible suffering, wars, famines, plagues, genocides, and disasters both natural and artificial. I see a species that has experienced more than its share of pain, he said finally.
Yes, but that's not what makes humans unique. Every species has experienced suffering. What makes humans different is your response to it.
She highlighted specific events, the reconstruction efforts after devastating wars, the mutual aid during natural disasters, the sacrifices made by individuals for the benefit of strangers. Most species, when faced with existential threats, either overcome them through superior technology and organization, or they're destroyed by them.
But humans seem to be forged by suffering rather than broken by it.
She paused the display on an image that made Marcus's heart clench, a photograph from the aftermath of Earth's conquest, showing human survivors sharing their meager supplies with the wounded. This was taken 3 days after the Imperial fleet completed its subjugation of your world. Your cities were in ruins, your governments had collapsed, and your people were facing starvation and disease.
By all rational measures, this should have been the end of human civilization.
She turned to look at him directly.
Instead, your people began to rebuild. Not just physically, but socially.
Communities that had never cooperated before began working together. Strangers shared resources with other strangers.
It was unprecedented.
Marcus remembered those days, though he had been very young at the time. The world had seemed like it was ending, but somehow people had found ways to help each other survive. His mother had been one of those who organized food distribution in their sector of the ruins, making sure that everyone got something even when there wasn't enough to go around. Most conquered species either submit completely to imperial authority or launch feudal resistance movements that accomplish nothing but increased suffering, Princess Verity continued.
But humans did something else entirely. You created parallel societies, unofficial networks of mutual aid and cooperation that operated beneath the Empire's notice. You preserved your culture, your values, and your sense of identity even under occupation.
She manipulated the display to show more recent images, underground schools where human children learned about their history, hidden workshops where traditional crafts were preserved, secret meetings where people planned for a future beyond imperial rule. It's been 15 years since Earth's conquest, and we still can't fully control your population. Not because you're actively rebellious, you're far too smart for that, but because you refuse to become what we expect conquered peoples to become. She leaned back in her chair, studying him with those golden eyes.
You maintain your humanity even under conditions designed to strip it away. Is that what this is about? Marcus asked. You want to understand how to break that resistance?
At first, yes. My initial interest in you was purely practical. If I could understand how to break human psychological resilience, it would be valuable information for the Empire. She paused, as if considering how much to reveal.
But something changed as I studied your reactions to my various experiments. I began to realize that I wasn't trying to break you for the Empire's benefit. I was trying to break you for my own. Why? Princess Verity H was quiet for a long moment, staring at the historical displays floating around them. When she spoke again, her voice was softer than Marcus had ever heard it. Because you represent something that I was taught doesn't exist. You represent the idea that there are things worth more than power, more valuable than survival, more important than winning. She turned to meet his gaze. My entire life has been built around the assumption that might makes right, that the strong naturally rule the weak, and that any philosophy that suggests otherwise is naive romanticism. But, you. She gestured to the images surrounding them, the long history of human suffering and human endurance. You come from a species that has been prey for most of its existence. You're physically weaker than most sentient species, you lack natural weapons or armor, and your technology was primitive when we conquered you. By every logical measure, humans should be a footnote in galactic history, another failed species that couldn't adapt to a hostile universe. The display shifted again, showing images of human achievements, art, music, literature, science, and acts of courage that defied rational explanation. Instead, you've created something remarkable. Not through superior strength or advanced technology, but through this peculiar ability to find meaning in meaningless circumstances. To maintain hope in the face of despair. To sacrifice for abstract principles even when doing so serves no practical purpose. She stood and began pacing around the console, her movements thoughtful rather than predatory. Do you know what I find most disturbing about your species, Marcus Chen? It's not your stubborn resistance to authority or your refusal to accept your place in the natural order. It's the possibility that you might be right. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. This was no longer a conversation between torturer and victim, or even between conqueror and conquered. This was a dialogue between two intelligent beings grappling with fundamental questions about the nature of strength, meaning, and what it meant to be truly civilized. Right about what? He asked. About the idea that some things are more important than power. That there are principles worth suffering for even when that suffering serves no strategic purpose. That maybe the ability to maintain your humanity under inhuman conditions is actually a form of strength rather than a weakness. Princess Verity H stopped pacing and looked directly at him, and Marcus could see something in her golden eyes that he had never expected to find there, uncertainty. If you're right, she said quietly, then everything I've been taught about strength and civilization is wrong. If you're right, then the empire I've devoted my life to serving is nothing more than organized brutality, and I am nothing more than a talented savage with delusions of sophistication. The weight of that statement hung between them like a physical presence. Marcus realized that he was witnessing something extraordinary, the moment when someone who had never questioned their fundamental assumptions was finally forced to confront the possibility that everything they believed might be false. What do you want from me? He asked. I want you to convince me that I'm wrong about you, she said. I want you to prove that human resistance is nothing more than stubborn pride, that your principles are just pretty words used to justify irrational behavior, and that your species' reputation for resilience is based on nothing more than a fortunate combination of genetics and circumstances. And if I can't? Princess Verity H smiled, but it was a sad expression, full of the weight of implications she was only beginning to understand. Then, I'll have to decide what to do with the knowledge that the empire I serve, the civilization I represent, and the life I've lived are all built on foundations of sand. As they sat surrounded by the holographic ghosts of human history, Marcus realized that their strange confrontation had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. Princess Verity H was no longer trying to break him, she was asking him to help her understand whether the things that made him unbreakable were real or illusion, whether human strength was genuine or imaginary. The most dangerous question in the universe, it seemed, wasn't how to break the human spirit, but whether the human spirit was worth emulating. The sessions in the historical archives continued for the next 2 weeks, but they bore no resemblance to the torture sessions that had come before. Instead, Marcus found himself engaged in the strangest conversations of his life, philosophical debates with a princess who was slowly dismantling the foundations of her own worldview. Princess Verity H was a remarkably intelligent being, with a mind that could process complex ideas with frightening speed and clarity. But intelligence, Marcus was learning, wasn't the same as wisdom.
The princess had been raised in a society that rewarded cunning, ruthlessness, and the efficient application of power. The idea that there might be forms of strength that had nothing to do with domination was genuinely foreign to her. "Explain sacrifice," she said during one of their sessions, while images of human history continued to rotate around them. "Not tactical sacrifice. I understand the concept of accepting losses to achieve strategic objectives. I mean the kind of sacrifice where individuals give up their lives, their happiness, or their safety for abstract principles that provide no material benefit." They were looking at a holographic recreation of the Underground Railroad, the network of people who had risked their lives to help escaped slaves reach freedom in pre-conquest America.
The images showed ordinary humans, farmers, shopkeepers, housewives, risking everything to help strangers they would never see again.
"Because it's the right thing to do," Marcus said, knowing how inadequate that answer would sound to someone from her background.
"But, right according to what standard?
If the law says slavery is legal, if society accepts it, if even the slaves themselves have been conditioned to accept their situation, then, by what authority do these individuals decide that their personal morality supersedes the established order?" Marcus studied the images floating around them. There was Harriet Tubman, who had returned to the South 19 times to lead slaves to freedom despite the enormous bounty on her head. There were the Quaker families who had turned their homes into stations on the Underground Railroad, knowing that discovery meant imprisonment or death.
I think they believe that some truths are bigger than the societies that try to suppress them," he said finally.
"That there are things that are right or wrong regardless of what the law says, regardless of what's convenient or safe."
Universal moral principles? Princess Verity's tone was skeptical. How wonderfully primitive.
Every species believes that their particular set of values represents universal truth.
What makes humans think their moral intuitions are any more valid than those of the Zephyrians or the Eltarians?
Maybe because we've been victims more often than victors, Marcus suggested. Most human history is the history of people trying to survive under systems designed to exploit or destroy them. When you spend most of your existence being prey, you develop a different understanding of what strength really means. The princess was quiet for a moment, manipulating the displays to show different periods of human suffering: the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, the famines of the 20th century, and countless other examples of humanity's capacity for both inflicting and enduring terrible pain. "Yet you also show remarkable capacity for inflicting suffering on your own species," she observed. "Humans have practiced slavery, genocide, torture, and every other form of cruelty known to intelligent life. How do you reconcile your species' reputation for empathy with its obvious capacity for evil?" It was a fair question, and one that Marcus had wrestled with many times. The same species that had produced Martin Luther King and Gandhi had also produced Hitler and Stalin. The same capacity for moral reasoning that led some humans to risk their lives for strangers also allowed others to justify the most horrific atrocities.
"I think," he said slowly, "that's exactly the point. Humans aren't naturally good or naturally evil.
We're naturally capable of both.
Which means that being good, being truly human in the best sense, requires constant choice. Every day, every moment, we have to decide whether to be the people we want to be or the people our worst impulses tell us to be. So human morality is nothing more than an ongoing internal struggle between competing impulses? Not nothing more, but that's part of it, yes. The part that makes it meaningful."
Marcus paused, trying to find words for something he had never articulated before. If goodness came naturally to us, if we were programmed to be altruistic and self-sacrificing, then there would be no moral weight to our choices. It's the fact that we're capable of evil that makes choosing good actually significant. Princess Verity stared at him for a long moment, her golden eyes reflecting the light from the holographic displays.
"You're suggesting that moral behavior is only meaningful when it's chosen in opposition to other impulses?" "I'm suggesting that moral behavior is only meaningful when it's actually a choice. If you can only be good, then goodness becomes meaningless. If you can only be evil, then evil becomes inevitable. But if you can be either."
Marcus gestured to the images surrounding them, the whole complex tapestry of human history with its mix of heroism and horror. "Then, every choice to be better than your nature demands becomes an act of genuine courage."
"And you believe this makes humans superior to species that are naturally altruistic or naturally hierarchical?" "Not superior. different. Maybe more complicated.
Marcus thought about his mother, who had shared her meager food with starving neighbors despite barely having enough to keep herself alive.
My mother used to say that being human wasn't about being perfect. It was about trying to be better tomorrow than you were today, even when everything around you was falling apart. The princess manipulated the displays again, focusing on a different aspect of human history, the rebuilding efforts after major disasters. Cities rising from rubble, communities forming from scattered refugees, people choosing to hope even when hope seemed irrational. Your species does seem remarkably resilient, she admitted. But resilience isn't the same as wisdom. Cockroaches are resilient too, but that doesn't make them admirable.
True. But cockroaches don't choose to be resilient. They just are. Humans choose to get back up every time we're knocked down, even when staying down would be easier and safer.
We choose to rebuild even when we know that what we build will probably be destroyed again.
We choose to hope even when hope has been proven wrong 1,000 times before.
Why?
It was a simple question, but Marcus found himself struggling to answer it.
Why did humans keep trying in the face of overwhelming evidence that the universe was hostile and uncaring?
Why did they continue to believe in things like justice and love and redemption when experience taught them that such things were rare and fragile? Because, he said finally, the alternative is to stop being human. Princess Verity leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. They sat in silence for several minutes, surrounded by the ghostly images of human history, each lost in their own thoughts.
I've been thinking about our conversations, she said eventually. About the things you've told me, the ideas you've presented. And I find myself facing a troubling possibility.
Which is
that I may have spent my entire life being wrong about the most fundamental questions of existence.
She stood and began pacing, but her movements were thoughtful rather than agitated. I was raised to believe that strength was the ability to impose your will on others, that intelligence was the capacity to manipulate circumstances to your advantage, and that the ultimate goal of any rational being was to accumulate power and use it to secure their position in the hierarchy. She paused in front of one of the displays, which was showing images of human parents caring for their children, not the grand gestures of history, but the simple everyday acts of love and sacrifice that were repeated billions of times throughout human civilization. But, if you're right, if these simple acts of ordinary goodness are more meaningful than all the empires and conquests in galactic history, then I've been pursuing things that are ultimately worthless. I've been defining myself by my ability to dominate others when I should have been defining myself by my ability to lift them up. Marcus watched her carefully. There was something vulnerable in her posture, something almost fragile in the way she was holding herself. This was a being who had never questioned her fundamental assumptions about reality, and the process of doing so was clearly causing her considerable distress. It doesn't have to be an either-or choice, he said gently. You can acknowledge that you've made mistakes without completely rejecting everything you are. Humans do it all the time, we call it growing up. She turned to look at him, and, for the first time since he had met her, Princess Verity looked uncertain. Not angry or cruel or calculating, but genuinely lost. How do I grow up from being a princess of the most powerful empire in galactic history? How do I change course when I'm responsible for the lives and deaths of billions of beings? One choice at a time, Marcus said. One moment at a time. One person at a time. Over the following days, their conversations took on a different quality. Princess Verity was no longer interrogating Marcus about human nature, she was asking for his help in understanding what it might mean to live differently. She told him about her childhood, about the pressures of being groomed from birth to rule an empire, about the expectations that had shaped every aspect of her life. I was 3 years old when they gave me my first combat instructor, she said during one session. By the time I was 10, I could kill most sentient beings in dozens of different ways. By 15, I had mastered the political intricacies of managing a dozen different species. By 20, I was commanding fleets and managing the conquest of entire systems. She paused, staring at a holographic display that showed human children playing in a park, their laughter silent but somehow audible in the joy on their faces. I was never allowed to just be. Everything I did was preparation for rulership, training for dominance, education in the efficient application of power. I was taught that emotions were weaknesses to be controlled, that empathy was a vulnerability to be overcome, and that the only relationships worth cultivating were those that served strategic purposes. Marcus thought about his own childhood, the poverty and uncertainty, but also the warmth of his mother's love, the friendships formed in the ruins of Detroit, the simple pleasure of reading books by candlelight or watching the sunrise over the broken city. It hadn't been easy, but it had been fundamentally human in ways that Princess Verity's upbringing apparently never was.
"Do you think it's too late?" she asked suddenly. "Do you think someone like me, someone who has spent their entire life learning how to dominate and destroy, can learn how to do something else?" "I don't know," Marcus said honestly. "But I think the fact that you're asking the question is probably a good sign."
Their conversations were interrupted one morning by the arrival of Administrator THYSS, who entered the archive chamber with an expression of barely concealed alarm. The ancient alien's silver hair seemed dimmer than usual, and his movements carried an urgency that Marcus had never seen before. "Your Highness," he said, bowing formally to Princess Verity. "I apologize for the interruption, but there are developments that require your immediate attention." "What developments?" the princess asked, but Marcus could see that she already suspected what was coming. "Emperor Karzak has learned of your extended presence at the academy. He has dispatched a fleet to collect you, and they will arrive within the next 6 hours." The Emperor's message indicated considerable displeasure with what he termed your philosophical wanderings. Princess Verity closed her eyes, and, for a moment she looked like nothing more than a young woman facing the consequences of disappointing her father. When she opened them again, however, the steel had returned to her gaze.
"I see. And what of Mr. Chen?" The Emperor's instructions regarding the human student were specific. "He is to be transferred to the Imperial Research Division for comprehensive psychological evaluation. The Emperor wishes to understand what methods were used to influence your thinking." Marcus felt ice settle in his stomach. The Imperial Research Division was where enemies of the Empire went to be broken in ways that made Princess Verity's torture sessions look gentle by comparison. If they transferred him there, he would disappear into the Empire's vast bureaucracy of suffering and never be seen again. "I won't allow that," Princess Verity said firmly. "Your Highness, with respect, the Emperor's word is law. Even for you." "Not in this." She stood, and, suddenly, she was every inch the Imperial Princess again, beautiful, powerful, and absolutely certain of her authority. "Mr. Chen is under my personal protection. Any attempt to transfer him will be considered an act of treason against the throne." Administrator THYSS looked deeply uncomfortable. "Your Highness, your father will not accept such defiance. If you openly oppose his will in this matter, it will force him to take actions that neither of you may want. Then, perhaps it's time for such actions to be taken." Princess Verity turned to look at Marcus, and he could see the decision crystallizing in her golden eyes. "Administrator THYSS, please prepare a shuttle for immediate departure. Mr. Chen and I will be leaving the academy." "Your Highness, that would be what it would be, Administrator, is my choice to make." She moved to the archive's communication console and began entering commands with swift, sure movements. "I'm transmitting new orders to the Imperial fleet. They are to maintain their current position and await further instructions. Any ship that attempts to dock with this station without my explicit permission will be fired upon. Your Highness, you cannot declare war on your own father." "I'm not declaring war on anyone. I'm asserting my right as an Imperial Princess to conduct my own diplomatic missions without interference." She finished entering the commands and turned back to face both of them. "Mr. Chen, would you be willing to accompany me to Earth? I believe it's time I saw your homeworld for myself." Marcus stared at her, hardly able to believe what he was hearing. "You want to go to Earth?" "I want to see what your people have built from the ruins of conquest. I want to understand what human civilization looks like when it's not filtered through imperial reports and propaganda. And..." She paused, as if surprised by her own words. "And I want to see if it's possible for someone like me to learn how to be something other than what I was trained to be." "The Emperor will never allow this," Administrator THYSS said. "If you leave the academy with the human student, if you go to Earth without authorization, he will consider it an act of rebellion. You'll be placing your succession in jeopardy." "Good," Princess Verity H said simply. Maybe it's time for the Empire to have a different kind of ruler. Or maybe it's time for the Empire to discover that it doesn't need rulers at all. As alarms began sounding throughout the academy, indicating the approach of the Emperor's fleet, Marcus found himself at the center of a decision that would reshape the balance of power in the galaxy. A princess who had been trained from birth to rule through fear and domination was choosing to risk everything to explore the possibility that there might be a better way to live. "Are you sure about this?" he asked her. Princess Verity H looked around the archive chamber, with its holographic displays still showing the complex tapestry of human history, the suffering and the hope, the failure and the resilience, the endless cycle of falling down and getting back up again. "No," she said. "But I'm beginning to think that certainty is overrated. Sometimes the most important choices are the ones we make without knowing how they'll turn out." The shuttle bay was in chaos when they arrived, with Academy personnel scrambling to prepare for the arrival of the Emperor's fleet. Princess Verity H moved through the confusion with purposeful strides, her royal authority opening doors and clearing paths despite the obvious confusion of the staff about what was happening. The shuttle she had commanded was a sleek civilian transport, fast enough to outrun military vessels but small enough to avoid detection if necessary. As they boarded, Marcus caught sight of three familiar figures waiting by the airlock: Keth, Zira, and Vex, all carrying travel bags and wearing expressions of determined loyalty. "What are you doing here?" Marcus asked. "Coming with you, obviously," Zira replied, her scales flickering with nervous energy. "Did you really think we'd let you face whatever comes next by yourself?" "The Empire will consider you traitors for this," Marcus warned them. "The Empire already considers us inferior because of our species and homeworld status," Keth said with uncharacteristic steel in his voice. "If we're going to be rebels, we might as well be rebels for something that matters." Princess Verity H watched this exchange with something that might have been wonder. "You would risk everything for friendship? For loyalty to someone who isn't even your own species?" "Friendship doesn't care about species boundaries," Vex replied through his translator. "Loyalty doesn't require genetic similarity. These are choices we make because of who we choose to be, not because of what we were born as." As the shuttle lifted off from the Academy's docking bay, Marcus looked back through the small porthole to see the massive shapes of Imperial warships dropping out of hyperspace. They were beautiful in their way, sleek vessels that represented the pinnacle of technological achievement and military efficiency. But they were also symbols of a philosophy that he was only now beginning to fully understand. The idea that might made right, that the strong naturally ruled the weak, and that the ultimate purpose of intelligence was the accumulation and efficient application of power. "Where do we go from here?" he asked Princess Verity H as she piloted the shuttle away from the Academy. "Earth," she said simply. "I want to see what your people have built. I want to understand what human strength looks like when it's not being tested by external threats. And I want to find out if it's possible for someone who was trained to be a tyrant to learn how to be something else." As their shuttle jumped into hyperspace, leaving behind the Academy and the approaching Imperial fleet, Marcus realized that everything had changed. What had begun as a simple educational opportunity had evolved into something much larger, a challenge to the fundamental assumptions that governed the galaxy's most powerful empire. Princess Verity H was no longer trying to break him. Instead, she was asking him to help her discover whether the things that made him unbreakable were real, whether they could be learned, and whether they might offer a path to a different kind of strength than the one she had been taught to pursue. The question now was whether Earth, his broken, conquered, struggling homeworld, could provide the answers they were both looking for. The journey to Earth took 3 days through hyperspace, and Marcus used that time to prepare Princess Verity H and his friends for what they would find there. Earth was not the gleaming showcase world that the Empire liked to display to visiting dignitaries. It was a planet still recovering from conquest, still struggling to rebuild civilization from the ruins of war, still learning how to hope again after 15 years of occupation. The major population centers are still mostly ruins, Marcus explained as they sat in the shuttle's small common area. The Empire relocated most survivors to designated settlement zones that are easier to monitor and control. The old cities like New York, London, Tokyo, they're ghost towns now, partially demolished and left to decay. Princess Verity H studied the holographic displays showing Earth's current status.
The planet looked like a wound, brown scars where forests had been cleared for mining operations, gray patches where cities had been leveled and never rebuilt, and scattered points of light representing the settlement zones where humanity's remnant struggled to survive. "It looks broken," she said quietly. "It is broken," Marcus agreed. "But broken doesn't mean dead. My people were good at making something from nothing, at finding ways to survive in places where survival should be impossible. When they finally dropped out of hyperspace in Earth's solar system, the first thing that struck Marcus was how different it looked from his memories. The orbital platforms were bigger now, more numerous, their lights creating a false constellation around his homeworld. The Imperial presence had grown substantially since he had left for the Academy. "There," he said, pointing to a section of what had once been the eastern United States. "The Detroit Settlement Zone. That's where I grew up." Princess Verity piloted their shuttle toward the coordinates Marcus provided, but, as they entered Earth's atmosphere, alarms began sounding throughout the cabin. 3 Imperial patrol craft had detected their approach and were moving to intercept. "Unidentified vessel, you are entering restricted airspace," came a voice over the communication system. "Reduce speed and prepare to be boarded for inspection." "This is Princess Verity of the Imperial House," she replied, activating her personal command codes. "You will escort us to the surface immediately and provide no further interference." There was a long pause on the communications channel, undoubtedly while the patrol craft verified her identity and tried to understand why an Imperial princess was arriving on Earth in an unmarked civilian shuttle. Finally, the voice returned, considerably more respectful in tone. "Your Highness, we were not informed of your visit. Please accept our escort to the primary administrative facility where Governor Thane can properly receive you." "That won't be necessary. We will be making a direct landing at the settlement zone designated as Detroit 7. Maintain your distance and do not interfere with our operations." "Your Highness, that area is not considered secure for someone of your status. The governor would strongly recommend. The governor's recommendations are noted and rejected. You have your orders." As their shuttle descended through the clouds, Marcus got his first clear view of his homeworld in over 2 years. The landscape below was a patchwork of recovery and devastation areas where human communities had managed to create something resembling normal life, interspersed with vast stretches of wasteland where nothing had been rebuilt. The Detroit settlement zone was larger than Marcus remembered, sprawling across several square kilometers of what had once been the city's industrial district. From the air, it looked like any refugee camp that had grown into a permanent community. Rows of prefabricated housing units, communal facilities, and workshops where the residents tried to maintain some semblance of economic activity. But, as they landed in a cleared area that served as the settlement's unofficial spaceport, Marcus could see signs of something more. There were gardens growing between the housing units, children playing in organized recreational areas, and what looked like genuine attempts to create community spaces and gathering places. His people hadn't just survived, they had tried to build something worth living in. A crowd had gathered to watch the shuttle land, drawn by curiosity about who would be visiting their isolated community. Marcus recognized some of the faces, older now, marked by years of hardship, but familiar from his childhood. When the shuttle's airlock cycled open and he stepped out, the murmur of recognition rippled through the crowd. "Marcus? Marcus Chen? Is that really you?" The voice belonged to Dr. Sarah Williams, who had been his mother's closest friend and had helped raise him after she died. She was grayer now, more weathered, but her eyes still held the warmth he remembered from his childhood. "Hello, Dr. Williams," he said, and suddenly, he was being pulled into a fierce hug that made him remember what it felt like to be home. "We heard you won a scholarship to the Imperial Academy," she said, holding him at arm's length to study his face. "We've been so proud, so hopeful that you'd come back with knowledge that could help us, but, Marcus, what are you doing here? And who are these people?" Marcus turned to see Princess Verity emerging from the shuttle, followed by Kath, Zira, and Vex. The princess had changed out of her royal attire into simple civilian clothes, but there was no mistaking her bearing or the subtle authority in her movements. The crowd's reaction to her was immediate and complex, curiosity mixed with wariness, the instinctive caution of people who had learned that visitors from outside their community often brought trouble. "Dr. Williams, I'd like you to meet some friends from the academy," Marcus said carefully. He had decided during the journey that revealing Princess Verityh's true identity immediately would likely cause panic or hostility that wouldn't help anyone.
This is Vara, Keth, Zira, and Vex. They wanted to visit Earth to better understand human culture.
Dr. Williams studied the group with the sharp eyes of someone who had learned to assess threats quickly. Marcus could see her taking in details, the quality of their clothing, the way they carried themselves, the obvious signs that these were not ordinary students from primitive worlds.
Well, she said finally, any friends of Marcus are welcome here. Though I have to ask, are you all aware that Earth is under Imperial occupation? Unauthorized visits from off-world can create complications.
We're aware of the situation, Princess Verityh said, and Marcus noticed that she had modulated her voice to remove most of its natural authority. We won't be staying long, and we have no intention of causing problems for your community. Dr. Williams nodded, but Marcus could see that she remained suspicious.
In that case, you're welcome to look around. Marcus, your old friends will want to see you. And there are some developments since you left that I think will interest you.
As they walked through the settlement, Marcus was struck by how much had changed in just 2 years. The community had grown, certainly, but, more importantly, it had evolved. What had once been a simple collection of survival shelters had become something that actually resembled a town, complete with workshops, schools, and even what appeared to be a small medical facility.
How is this possible? He asked Dr. Williams. I thought the Empire restricted construction in the settlement zones.
They do, officially. But we've learned to work within the system.
Small improvements, incremental changes, nothing big enough to attract official attention. The key is to make everything look temporary even when it isn't.
She gestured to a building that appeared to be a simple warehouse but was clearly serving as a community center.
We've also learned that Imperial administrators prefer to focus on paperwork rather than actual inspection.
As long as we file the right reports and pay the right fees, they mostly leave us alone. Princess Verityh was listening to this conversation with obvious fascination.
You've created a parallel administrative system, she said.
A way to achieve your actual goals while maintaining the appearance of compliance with Imperial regulations.
We've learned to survive, Dr. Williams replied simply. It's what humans do.
As they continued their tour, Marcus began to understand what his people had accomplished. They hadn't just endured 15 years of occupation, they had used that time to quietly rebuild their civilization in ways that the Empire either didn't notice or didn't care about. There were schools where children learned not just Imperial curriculum but human history and culture. There were workshops where traditional crafts and technologies were preserved and developed. There were even what appeared to be research facilities where human scientists worked on projects that had nothing to do with Imperial priorities. We call it the deep community, explained Dr. Williams when Marcus asked about the organizational structure. The visible layer that the Empire sees and interacts with, and the deeper layer where we pursue our own goals and maintain our own values. It took years to build, and it only works because everyone understands the importance of discretion. They stopped at a building that looked like a typical settlement workshop from the outside, but when Dr. Williams led them inside, Marcus discovered that it housed one of the most sophisticated research facilities he had ever seen. Human scientists were working on projects ranging from sustainable agriculture to renewable energy to what appeared to be advanced computing systems.
This is incredible, Keth whispered, his 4 eyes wide with amazement. How did you acquire this level of technology without Imperial approval?
We built it ourselves, said a familiar voice from across the lab. Marcus turned to see Professor James Wright, who had taught physics at the University of Michigan before the conquest. He was older now, his hair completely white, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that Marcus remembered.
Professor Wright. I didn't know you were here.
I've been here since the university was closed down, Wright replied, embracing Marcus warmly. Along with about 50 other faculty members from various institutions. We couldn't teach officially anymore, so we decided to focus on research instead.
But the equipment, the facilities.
Salvaged, rebuilt, improvised, and, occasionally, liberated from Imperial installations that were being decommissioned. Wright's smile was mischievous. You'd be amazed what you can accomplish with spare parts, determination, and 15 years of accumulated expertise.
Princess Verity H was studying the laboratory equipment with obvious admiration. This represents a significant technological capability. Surely the Empire's administrative surveys would have detected such development. The Empire sees what it expects to see, Wright explained. They expect conquered peoples to be dependent, grateful for basic necessities, and incapable of significant independent development. So when they look at our settlement, they see exactly that, a community of grateful survivors making do with imperial charity. But, underneath, we're preparing for the future. Building the knowledge base and technological infrastructure that we'll need when circumstances change. Wright's expression grew serious. We know this situation can't last forever. Either the Empire will eventually decide we're no longer worth the administrative expense and withdraw, or something will happen that gives us an opportunity to reclaim our independence. When that day comes, we want to be ready. As they continued through the settlement, Marcus began to see the full scope of what his people had accomplished. It wasn't just survival or even recovery, it was transformation. The humans in the Detroit settlement zone had used their 15 years of occupation to become something new, something that combined the best of their pre-conquest civilization with hard-earned lessons about resilience and adaptation. There were artists creating works that captured both the pain of loss and the hope of renewal. There were teachers passing on not just knowledge but the values and perspectives that made humanity unique. There were engineers and scientists working on technologies that could improve life not just for humans but for any species that chose cooperation over domination. I don't understand, Princess Verity H said quietly as they paused in the settlement's central square, where children were playing games that combined human traditions with elements borrowed from other species they had encountered. According to every model of post-conquest development, subjugated populations either assimilate into imperial culture or decline into permanent dependency. They don't evolve. They do if they're human, Marcus said, finally, beginning to understand what his mother had meant when she told him to stay human no matter what happened. Being human wasn't just about biology or culture, it was about the choice to continue growing, learning, and becoming better even under the worst possible circumstances. That evening, the settlement's leaders gathered in the community center to meet with Marcus and his companions. It was an informal gathering, no official titles or ceremonial protocols, just people who had earned respect through their contributions to the community's survival and growth. Dr. Williams served as the group's unofficial spokesperson, but Marcus could see that decisions were made through consensus rather than hierarchical authority. It was a form of governance he had never encountered before, democratic but not chaotic, organized but not rigid, efficient but not dehumanizing. "We're honored by your visit," Dr. Williams said as the group settled around a collection of salvaged tables and chairs. "Marcus has told us that you're students at the Imperial Academy, interested in learning about human culture. We're happy to share what we've learned, but I hope you understand that we have to be careful about what information we provide to off-worlders." Princess Verity H nodded. "I understand your caution. But I want you to know that we're not here as representatives of Imperial authority. We're here because we believe that your experiences, your methods of adaptation and survival might offer insights that could benefit other communities facing similar challenges." "Other communities?" asked Professor Wright. "Are you suggesting that there are other species dealing with post-conquest transition issues?" "More than you might imagine," Keth replied. "The Empire incorporates dozens of new worlds every year, and the integration process isn't always smooth." What followed was one of the most extraordinary conversations Marcus had ever witnessed. The settlement's leaders began sharing their experiences, the mistakes they had made, the solutions they had developed, the principles that had guided their efforts to rebuild civilization under occupation. In return, Princess Verity H and his friends from the Academy shared their own perspectives on imperial policies and the challenges faced by other conquered species. Gradually, Marcus began to see what was really happening. This wasn't just a cultural exchange or even a diplomatic meeting. This was the beginning of something much larger, a recognition that the Empire's standard model of conquest and integration was fundamentally flawed, and that the solutions developed by human communities might offer alternatives that could benefit everyone. "The Empire assumes that strength means domination," Princess Verity H said during one particularly intense discussion about governance models. "But what you've created here suggests that real strength might come from the ability to adapt, to grow, to
to find ways to thrive even under adverse conditions.
Not just thrive, Dr. Williams corrected gently. To become better than you were before the adversity began. Humans have a saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But, we've learned that it's not automatically true. Adversity only makes you stronger if you choose to learn from it, to grow from it, to use it as fuel for becoming the person you want to be rather than a victim of circumstances. And, how do you make that choice? How do you maintain hope and humanity in the face of overwhelming oppression?
The room was quiet for a moment as the settlement leaders considered the question. Finally, it was Marcus who spoke.
You remember that you're not alone.
That even when everything seems hopeless, there are other people facing the same challenges, making the same choices to keep going, to keep trying to be better than their circumstances. You remember that your actions matter not just to yourself, but to everyone who comes after you. Princess Verity stared at him, and Marcus could see something shifting in her golden eyes.
You're saying that individual choices create collective strength?
I'm saying that collective strength comes from individuals who choose to be strong together rather than separately. The Empire teaches that strength comes from hierarchy, from some people being powerful enough to control others. But, we've learned that real strength comes from everyone choosing to contribute to something bigger than themselves. As the evening continued, the conversation evolved from cultural exchange to something approaching political philosophy. The settlement leaders shared their vision of what human civilization could become, not a return to pre-conquest status, but something new that incorporated the lessons learned from 15 years of survival and adaptation. Princess Verity shared her own growing understanding that the Empire's approach to governance might be fundamentally unsustainable, that ruling through fear and domination created systems that were powerful but brittle, impressive but ultimately hollow. I've spent my entire life learning how to command others, she said. But, what you've built here suggests that the most important skill might be learning how to inspire others to command themselves. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. The community center's door opened to admit a figure in imperial uniform, Governor Thane himself, accompanied by a small escort of security personnel.
The room fell silent as the Empire's administrative representative for Earth entered.
Governor Thane was a middle-aged Zephyrian with the typical purple skin and silver markings, but his bearing suggested a career bureaucrat rather than a military commander. His expression was carefully neutral as he surveyed the gathered humans and their off-world guests. Dr. Williams, he said with formal politeness. I apologize for the late hour, but I understand you have visitors who arrived without following proper diplomatic protocols. Marcus felt tension ripple through the room as the settlement leaders prepared for what could easily become a confrontation that would end with arrests, deportations, or worse. But, before Dr. Williams could respond, Princess Verity stood.
Governor Thane, I believe you're looking for me. The governor's expression changed dramatically as he recognized her.
His formal politeness shifted to barely concealed panic as he realized that the heir to the imperial throne was sitting in a human settlement's community center engaged in what could easily be interpreted as seditious political discussions.
Your Highness.
I had no idea. We were told only that an unauthorized shuttle had landed in the settlement zone. If I had known you were aboard, I would have provided appropriate escort and accommodation. That won't be necessary, Governor. I'm here on an informal fact-finding mission, and I prefer to observe local conditions without the complications that official protocols tend to create. Governor Thane looked deeply uncomfortable. Your Highness, while I certainly appreciate your interest in local affairs, I must point out that this particular community has a history of non-compliance with certain imperial regulations. I'm not certain it provides a representative sample of post-conquest integration success.
On the contrary, Princess Verity replied smoothly.
I find their approach to adaptation quite fascinating.
Please, join us.
I was just learning about their methods for maintaining social cohesion during the transition period. The governor clearly had no choice but to comply, but Marcus could see that he was deeply unhappy about the situation. As he took a seat at the edge of the group, his security escort remained standing near the door, not quite threatening, but clearly ready to act if the situation deteriorated.
Perhaps Your Highness would prefer a formal briefing on settlement administration, Governor Thane suggested.
I have comprehensive reports on productivity metrics, compliance rates, and integration benchmarks that might be more informative than anecdotal discussions.
I'm sure your reports are very thorough, Governor. But I'm more interested in understanding the human perspective on these matters. Dr. Williams, you were explaining your community's approach to education? What followed was a careful dance of diplomacy. Dr. Williams and the other settlement leaders continued their discussion of community development, but now they had to balance honesty with the need to avoid saying anything that could be interpreted as criticism of imperial policies. Governor Thane listened with obvious tension, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation but unable to intervene directly without offending Princess Verity H. Marcus watched this interplay with growing understanding. This was what the real work of resistance looked like, not dramatic gestures or violent confrontations, but the patient, careful navigation of systems designed to control you, finding ways to achieve your actual goals while maintaining the appearance of compliance. Your community seems remarkably cohesive, Princess Verity H observed. How do you maintain social order without more direct administrative oversight? We've found that people are generally willing to cooperate when they feel that they have a voice in decision-making, Dr. Williams replied carefully. Shared responsibility tends to create shared commitment. Governor Thane shifted uncomfortably. Of course, such approaches work best within the framework of proper imperial oversight, he interjected. Left entirely to their own devices, primitive populations often lack the organizational sophistication necessary for large-scale coordination. Is that your experience, Dr. Williams? Princess Verity H asked. There was a moment of dangerous silence as everyone in the room realized that they had reached the point where continued diplomacy might require someone to compromise their fundamental beliefs. Dr. Williams looked at Governor Thane, then at Princess Verity H, then at Marcus. Your Highness, she said finally, I think human communities are capable of more sophisticated self-organization than imperial administrative models typically assume. It was a carefully worded statement, but everyone present understood its implications. Dr. Williams was politely but clearly stating that humans didn't need imperial oversight to govern themselves effectively, and that the Empire's assumptions about primitive populations were incorrect. Governor Thane's face darkened. Dr. Williams, such statements could be interpreted as questioning imperial policy, which, Princess Verity H interrupted smoothly, is exactly the kind of independent thinking that makes human communities so interesting to study. Governor, I appreciate your concern for proper protocol, but I'm here to learn, not to enforce compliance with administrative guidelines. The tension in the room was palpable, but Princess Verity H's authority was absolute. Governor Thane had no choice but to accept her statement, even though Marcus could see that he was already composing the reports he would file about this conversation. The meeting continued for another hour, but the dynamic had changed. The settlement leaders were more careful in their words, Princess Verity H was more diplomatic in her questions, and Governor Thane maintained a watchful silence that made everyone uncomfortable. Finally, Princess Verity H announced that she was tired and would like to rest before continuing her observations the next day. Dr. Williams offered to provide quarters for the group, and Governor Thane reluctantly agreed to withdraw his security escort under the princess's orders. As the official imperial presence departed, the settlement leaders began to disperse, but Dr. Williams asked Marcus and his companions to remain behind. I need to know, she said once they were alone, exactly who you people are and what you're really doing here. That wasn't a normal imperial inspection, and she's not a normal imperial student. Marcus looked at Princess Verity H, who nodded slightly. Her name is Princess Verity H, he said. She's the heir to the imperial throne. Dr. Williams stared at them for a long moment, and Marcus could see her processing the implications of what he had just told her. The Emperor's daughter. Here. In our settlement. Having political discussions about the nature of governance and resistance. She sat down heavily. Marcus, do you have any idea what you've done? I think I've given her a chance to see what humans are actually like when they're not being observed through imperial administrative filters, Marcus replied. And I think she's beginning to understand that there might be better ways to govern than through fear and domination. And what happens when she leaves? What happens when Governor Thane files his reports? What happens when the Emperor learns that his heir has been exposed to seditious ideas by a community of non-compliant humans? It was Princess Verity H who answered. What happens depends on what I choose to do with what I've learned here.
She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the settlement's quiet streets where humans were living lives that were circumscribed by imperial control but not defined by it. For my entire life, I was taught that the empire represents the pinnacle of civilization, that our methods of governance are the most efficient and effective possible, and that conquered species benefit from incorporation into our system. She turned back to face them.
But what I've seen here suggests that those teachings might be wrong. And if they are wrong?
Dr. Williams asked.
Then, I'll have to decide whether to spend my life perpetuating a system I no longer believe in, or find ways to change it into something better. The next morning brought news that changed everything.
A message arrived from the Imperial fleet informing Princess Verity that Emperor Karzak was en route to Earth personally, bringing with him a battle group of unprecedented size. He would arrive within 24 hours, and his intentions were clear: to collect his wayward daughter and deal with the human community that had been allowed to develop inappropriate ideas about governance and independence.
"He's not just coming to fetch me," Princess Verity said as she read the encrypted message. "He's coming to make an example.
To demonstrate what happens to communities that develop too much autonomy, that start to think they can govern themselves."
The implications were terrifying.
When the emperor decided to make an example of a community, that community ceased to exist. The Detroit settlement zone, with its 20,000 residents and its carefully built culture of adaptation and growth, could be wiped out in a matter of hours.
"We have to evacuate," Dr. Williams said immediately.
"Get people to the other settlement zones, scatter them so they can't all be destroyed at once."
"There isn't time," Princess Verity replied. "And, besides, he'll just hunt down the survivors. When my father decides to make a point, he's very thorough."
Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. This was his fault. His choice to resist Princess Verity's initial attempts to break him had led to her curiosity about human nature, which had led to their journey to Earth, which had led to the current crisis.
His people were about to pay the price for his stubbornness. "There has to be something we can do," he said.
Princess Verity was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the settlement where people were beginning to go about their daily routines, unaware that their world was about to end.
"There is," she said finally. "But it would require me to do something that would be considered treason by every definition of imperial law."
"What?" She turned to face him, and Marcus could see that she had made a decision that would change everything.
"I could declare Earth a protected world under my personal authority as heir to the throne.
It's an obscure legal provision, rarely used, but it would place this planet under my direct governance rather than standard imperial administration."
She paused. "The problem is that once I invoke that authority, I can't step back from it.
I would be committing myself to a path that leads either to fundamental changes in how the empire operates, or to civil war." The room was silent as everyone absorbed the implications of what she was suggesting. Princess Verity wasn't just offering to protect the settlement, she was offering to stake her claim to succession on the principle that conquered peoples deserved self-governance.
"Why would you do that?"
Dr. Williams asked.
"Because," Princess Verity said simply, "I've learned that being strong doesn't mean being able to dominate others. It means being willing to stand up for what you believe in, even when the cost is everything you thought you wanted."
She looked at Marcus, and he could see in her golden eyes the same quiet determination that had sustained him through weeks of torture. "Marcus Chin taught me that some things are worth more than power, more valuable than survival, more important than winning. He showed me that the greatest strength is the ability to remain who you choose to be, no matter what pressures are applied to make you become something else." As alarms began sounding throughout the settlement warning of the approaching Imperial fleet, Marcus realized that his long confrontation with Princess Verity had finally reached its conclusion. Not with his breaking or her victory, but with both of them choosing to be something more than what they had been trained to become. The silent human who had refused to kneel before imperial power had taught a princess that true authority came not from the ability to command others, but from the courage to command yourself. And, in learning that lesson, she had chosen to risk everything to protect the community that had shown her what human strength really meant. The battle for Earth's future was about to begin, but, for the first time since the conquest 15 years ago, humans wouldn't be fighting it alone. They would have an ally who understood that the greatest victory wasn't conquering your enemies, but becoming worthy of the loyalty you inspired in your friends. As Princess Verity began transmitting her declaration of protection to the approaching Imperial fleet, Marcus thought about his mother's final words: "Stay human, no matter what happens." He had stayed human through torture, through psychological manipulation, through the temptation to break under pressure. And, in doing so, he had helped someone else discover what it meant to be human too. The future was uncertain, the challenges ahead were enormous, and the outcome of the coming confrontation was far from guaranteed. But, for the first time since the conquest, humans were facing the future as allies rather than subjects, as partners rather than resources, as beings whose strength was recognized rather than dismissed. And that, Marcus realized, was worth everything he had endured to achieve.